New York City has always been a place where noise hides truth. Sirens echo through narrow streets, neon lights flicker over late-night diners, and millions of lives move past each other without ever truly connecting. But beneath that constant motion, another city once existed, one built on silence, loyalty, and unspoken rules. This was the New York that Thomas Bilotti came to know, not as a headline name, but as a shadow that moved carefully behind power. Thomas Bilotti was never meant to be famous. In the world he entered, visibility was a weakness. Power belonged to the men who spoke less, listened more, and stayed close to those who mattered. Bilotti's story does not begin with violence or ambition, but with proximity. He was born into an environment where organized crime was not an abstract idea, it was a quiet presence. Embedded in neighborhoods, family conversations, and local businesses that seemed ordinary on the surface. Growing up in New York during the mid-20th century meant learning early that there were two versions of the city. One was public and lawful. The other was controlled by invisible lines where certain names carried weight and certain doors opened without question. Bilotti learned to recognize those lines without ever crossing them too loudly. He was observant, disciplined, and careful, traits that would later define his role. Unlike men who chased recognition, Bilotti understood something essential. Survival in the Mafia world depended on restraint. The streets rewarded patience, not noise. While others sought attention through flashy behavior, Bilotti built his reputation quietly. He became known as someone dependable, someone who could be trusted to stay calm under pressure and loyal under uncertainty. Loyalty was not just a word in this world, it was currency. And Bilotti invested heavily in it. As organized crime families tightened their grip on New York's underground economy, enforcement became crucial. Leaders needed people who could carry out instructions without hesitation and without ego. Bilotti fit this role perfectly. He was not driven by the desire to lead, but by the desire to serve the structure that protected him. That mindset placed him close to powerful figures who valued reliability above all else. In the Mafia hierarchy, proximity to leadership often mattered more than rank. Being physically near power meant hearing conversations others never heard and understanding intentions before they were spoken aloud. Bilotti's presence near rising leadership figures was not accidental. It was earned through consistency. He did not gossip, he did not question orders, he did not act independently unless instructed. This quiet discipline brought him into the inner circle of one of New York's most dominant crime families. While the public saw names rise and fall through court cases and media stories, Bilotti remained largely unseen. Yet behind closed doors, his role expanded. He became an extension of leadership and enforcer, not just of orders, but of loyalty itself. The streets of Brooklyn and Manhattan during this era were changing rapidly. Law enforcement pressure increased, surveillance improved, and internal tensions grew within crime families. Many men panicked, making mistakes that exposed them. Bilotti did the opposite. He narrowed his circle, reduced his public presence, and stayed closer to those at the top. His strength was emotional control. In moments where others reacted impulsively, Bilotti stayed composed. This quality made him valuable in tense situations where a single wrong word could spark internal conflict. He became someone leaders trusted to be nearby during sensitive discussions, not to speak, but to ensure stability. But power always has a cost. As Bilotti's loyalty deepened, so did his entanglement. The more trusted he became, the less room he had to step away. In organized crime, loyalty is permanent. There is no retirement plan, no quiet exit. Every step forward narrows the path behind you. Despite this, Bilotti remained committed. He accepted the risks without complaint. To him, loyalty was identity. Betrayal was unthinkable. This mindset kept him alive longer than many of his contemporaries, but it also tied his fate to forces beyond his control. The city outside continued its rhythm, people commuting, families growing, lives unfolding, without awareness of the hidden power structures shaping certain outcomes. Bilotti existed in that invisible layer, where decisions were made quietly and consequences appeared suddenly. He did not seek cruelty, but he did not resist it when required. In the Mafia world, morality bends around obedience. Right and wrong are replaced with allowed and forbidden. Bilotti adapted fully to this code, suppressing personal judgment in favor of collective survival. As law enforcement attention intensified, the pressure on trusted insiders increased. Meetings became shorter, instructions became more coded. trust became rarer. Those closest to leadership bore the heaviest burden. Bilotti remained steady, even as danger closed in. Yet even in this controlled existence, there were moments of reflection. Brief, unspoken pauses where the weight of loyalty became heavy. The city he served silently was changing, and the old rules were eroding. Younger generations did not value patience the same way. Mistakes multiplied. The foundation began to crack. Thomas Bilotti stood near the center of this shifting world, not as a decision maker, but as a guardian of someone else's power. His life illustrates a critical truth about organized crime. The most dangerous roles are not always the loudest. Sometimes they belong to the men who stand quietly behind the throne. And while his story would eventually move toward an unavoidable conclusion, it is important to understand how it began, not with violence, but with silence, discipline, and unwavering loyalty. Because in the Mafia, the shadows are often more important than the spotlight. In New York's underground world, nothing was written down. There were no manuals, no contracts, no official introductions. Everything that mattered was learned by watching, listening, and surviving long enough to understand what was never said out loud. This was the environment where Thomas Bilotti refined his identity not as a leader, but as a man shaped by rules older than the streets themselves. The first lesson was silence. Not the absence of sound, but the discipline of knowing when not to speak. In this world, information was power, and careless words were liabilities. Bilotti learned early that the fastest way to lose trust was to talk too much. Men noticed restraint. They respected it. Silence suggested control, and control suggested reliability. New York's criminal structure was built like an invisible ladder. Advancement didn't come through applications or ambition. It came through observation. Bilotti studied how men entered rooms, where they stood, who they greeted first, and who they avoided entirely. He paid attention to subtle gestures, eye contact, posture, tone. Every detail communicated status. Money flowed through everyday places, small businesses, back offices, private clubs, and quiet conversations over coffee. Nothing looked dramatic from the outside. That was intentional. The goal was always to blend in, to make illegal operations look indistinguishable from normal commerce. Bilotti absorbed this philosophy fully. Flash attracted attention. Attention attracted consequences. Another rule became clear: loyalty was not emotional, it was functional. It didn't matter who you liked. What mattered was who you were aligned with, and how consistently you honored that alignment. Loyalty was measured by behavior over time, not by words spoken in moments of intensity. Bilotti proved himself through consistency, showing up, following instructions precisely, and never questioning authority in public. Violence, despite popular myths, was not constant. It was selective and controlled. The real power lay in reputation. The knowledge that violence could happen was often enough. Bilotti understood this distinction. He did not seek confrontation, but he also never hesitated when firmness was required. This balance made him dependable in sensitive situations where restraint mattered more than aggression. Trust was earned slowly. Men tested each other in subtle ways: small tasks, quiet responsibilities, minor risks. How someone handled these moments determined whether they would be included again. Bilotti passed these tests not by impressing anyone, but by never disappointing them. Reliability became his signature. As he moved deeper into this world, Bilotti learned another crucial rule: never outshine the man you serve. Ego destroyed more careers than law enforcement ever did. Those who tried to prove themselves often exposed themselves. Bilotti stayed deliberately in the background, allowing others to take credit while he ensured outcomes remained stable. The city itself acted as a teacher. Neighborhoods shifted. Old businesses closed. New ones opened. Power adapted. The criminal structure survived because it evolved quietly, adjusting tactics without announcing changes. Bilotti observed how leadership reacted to pressure not with panic, but with calculation. This approach influenced his own mindset. Fear existed, but it was internalized. No one admitted it. Instead, fear manifested as caution. Bilotti learned to plan every move with the assumption that someone was always watching. That awareness sharpened his discipline. Carelessness was not forgiven. Mistakes echoed longer than successes. One of the most important lessons was understanding consequences. In this world, consequences were final. There were no second chances for betrayal or recklessness. Knowing this created a culture of self-control. Bilotti embodied that control. He avoided excess, limited his exposure, and maintained a low profile that kept him off the radar of outsiders. Relationships were transactional, but not shallow. Long-term alliances mattered. Men remembered who stood firm during difficult moments. Bilotti built a reputation as someone steady under pressure, someone who didn't disappear when circumstances became complicated. That reliability quietly elevated his position. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that organized crime was less about crime and more about structure. Rules governed everything: who spoke, who acted, who decided. Order was enforced internally long before any external authority became involved. Bilotti respected this structure completely, understanding that chaos threatened everyone within it. Yet beneath the discipline, there was an unspoken cost. Living under constant restraint meant suppressing individuality. Personal desires became secondary to organizational needs. Bilotti accepted this without protest, but the sacrifice was real. Freedom was limited, choices narrowed, and identity became tied entirely to role. The world outside continued normally. Families gathered, children grew, and people lived lives untouched by these hidden systems. Bilotti existed parallel to that reality, aware that his choices separated him permanently from ordinary life. There was no turning back, not because of force, but because of commitment. As time passed, Bilotti's presence became expected. He was no longer evaluated, he was trusted. That trust brought proximity to decision-making, even without authority. Being near power meant absorbing its weight. Every instruction carried potential consequences that could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. Still, Bilotti never confused proximity with control. He knew his place. That humility preserved his standing longer than ambition ever could. He remained what the system needed him to be: a stabilizing force in an unstable world. This chapter of his life illustrates a broader truth. Organized crime does not survive on chaos, but on discipline. The men who last are not the loudest or the boldest, but the most controlled. Thomas Bilotti's rise was not dramatic, but it was deliberate. And while this path offered protection and status, it also quietly erased alternatives. Every rule learned narrowed the future. Every act of loyalty strengthened invisible chains. The system rewarded obedience, but it demanded total commitment in return. The lesson here is not admiration, but awareness. Criminal structures often appear powerful from the outside, but inside they are rigid, unforgiving systems that consume identity. Discipline without freedom becomes a prison, even when it feels like belonging. Bilotti's journey forward would be shaped by these lessons that defined not only how he moved, but how he thought. In a world ruled by silence, his strength lay in understanding the rules completely, even when they led somewhere irreversible. Power in New York's underworld was rarely announced. It didn't arrive with speeches or declarations. It revealed itself quietly through access. Who was allowed in certain rooms? Who stood nearby when sensitive conversations happened? Who remained present when others were asked to leave? This was the stage where Thomas Bilotti found his place, not as a decision-maker, but as someone trusted to stand close to power without ever reaching for it. Being near authority required a different kind of discipline. It meant understanding that your role was to protect stability, not to influence direction. Bilotti mastered this balance early. He listened carefully, absorbed information, and stored it without reacting. Leaders valued this quality because it reduced risk. A man who reacted emotionally could expose intentions. A man who stayed neutral protected everyone involved. As his proximity increased, so did the pressure. Standing close to power meant absorbing tension without releasing it. Conversations were often layered with meaning hidden beneath coded language. Single word could carry multiple instructions. Bilotti learned to interpret tone, pauses, and silence itself. What was not said often mattered more than what was spoken. There was also visibility. While he avoided public attention, those inside the structure noticed everything. Loyalty was constantly measured. One misstep could undo years of trust. Bilotti responded by tightening his routines. Predictability became his shield. He followed patterns, avoided unnecessary exposure, and maintained strict control over his behavior. Money, influence, and authority circulated around him, but he never reached for them directly. This restraint distinguished him from others who mistook proximity for entitlement. Bilotti understood that survival depended on humility. Those who believed closeness meant equality often disappeared from the picture. The environment around leadership was not glamorous. It was tense, calculated, and heavy with responsibility. Decisions made in quiet rooms affected entire neighborhoods and livelihoods. Bilotti witnessed how leaders weighed risks, considering not just profit, but reaction, enforcement, and internal stability. These observations shaped his understanding of power as burden rather than privilege. Trust deepened through consistency. When sensitive matters required discretion, Bilotti was present. When enforcement was needed, he carried it out without excess. He neither escalated nor hesitated. This reliability transformed him into a stabilizing presence someone leadership could depend on when circumstances became unpredictable. Yet closeness to power also meant exposure to its consequences. Every internal conflict, every shift in alliances, carried potential danger. Bilotti remained alert, aware that internal disputes were often more dangerous than external threats. Loyalty protected him, but it also bound him to outcomes he did not control. The streets outside continued their rhythm, unaware of the calculations happening behind closed doors. Businesses opened and closed, people moved on with their lives, but within this hidden layer, every change required adjustment. Bilotti observed how leadership adapted to pressure by reducing visibility, decentralizing operations, and reinforcing discipline. Silence became heavier. Meetings grew shorter. Trust circles tightened. Those allowed near leadership were chosen carefully. Bilotti's presence in these moments reflected not ambition, but necessity. He was there because he reduced uncertainty. In a world where mistakes were permanent, certainty was priceless. There were moments when power tested loyalty indirectly. Small decisions, subtle choices, opportunities to benefit personally at the expense of structure. Bilotti consistently chose restraint. He understood that short-term gain often led to long-term exposure. His refusal to exploit access reinforced trust further. Emotionally, the role demanded suppression. Witnessing tension, conflict, and consequence without reaction required internal control. Bilotti compartmentalized effectively. He separated personal feeling from professional obligation. This ability allowed him to function in high-pressure situations without outward stress. But such control carried internal cost. Living constantly alert narrowed emotional range. Relationships outside the structure remained limited. Normal life felt distant. Bilotti accepted this isolation as part of the role. Proximity to power required sacrifice, and he paid it quietly. Leadership valued those who protected authority without challenging it. Bilotti fit this expectation precisely. He was not a strategist, but a shield, not a voice, but a presence. In many ways, his role embodied the unseen architecture of organized crime, the support structures that allowed visible leaders to function. This chapter of his life highlights a crucial reality often misunderstood. The Mafia was not sustained by dramatic figures alone. It relied on disciplined individuals who understood limits and respected hierarchy. Bilotti's strength was not dominance but containment. As pressure from outside forces increased, the importance of internal stability grew. Leaders depended more heavily on trusted figures to maintain order and manage risk. Bilotti's value rose not because he sought it, but because circumstances demanded his skill set. Yet standing close to power is inherently dangerous. When authority shifts or collapses, those nearby often fall with it. Bilotti was aware of this reality, but he did not retreat. Commitment, once made, was absolute. There was no halfway position in this world. The lesson embedded here is subtle but important. Power attracts attention, but proximity to power attracts consequence. Those who choose to stand near authority without controlling it accept risks without rewards. In organized crime, such roles are essential but unforgiving. Bilotti's path forward would continue along this narrow line, close enough to influence outcomes indirectly, far enough to avoid overt visibility. It was a balancing act requiring constant awareness, restraint, and discipline. This phase of his life demonstrates how systems of crime rely less on chaos and more on structure. And within that structure, the quiet figures, those who stand close without speaking, often carry the greatest weight. Loyalty, in the world Thomas Bilotti inhabited, was not celebrated with speeches or rewards. It was measured quietly, often invisibly, through endurance. The longer a man remained consistent under pressure, the more valuable he became. But loyalty also carried weight, and over time that weight pressed down on every choice, every silence, every step taken without question. For Thomas Bilotti, obedience was not passive. It required constant awareness. Orders were rarely explicit. They arrived wrapped in implication, expectation, and timing. Understanding what was required meant understanding the people giving those instructions, the environment surrounding the request, and the risks involved if anything went wrong. The structure he served demanded reliability above all else. Emotional reactions were liabilities. Personal opinions were distractions. The system functioned best when individuals behaved like precise components in a larger machine. Bilotti had refined himself into such a component, steady, controlled, and predictable. But predictability did not mean safety. As pressure increased from outside forces, loyalty became a test rather than a virtue. Leaders relied more heavily on those closest to them, which meant exposure increased. Being trusted meant being present during moments of tension, uncertainty, and decision-making that carried consequences far beyond the room. Bilotti absorbed these moments without comment. His role was not to advise, but to ensure continuity. If something needed to be enforced, he did it cleanly. If silence was required, he maintained it. This obedience reinforced trust, but it also erased distance. The closer he stood to authority, the fewer exits remained. One of the unspoken costs of loyalty was moral compression. Over time, distinctions blurred. Actions were no longer evaluated by personal ethics, but by alignment with orders. This shift did not happen suddenly. It happened gradually, through repetition. Each obedient act made the next easier until obedience felt automatic. The environment reinforced this mindset. Questioning orders was interpreted as instability. Hesitation suggested weakness. Those who paused too long were viewed with suspicion. Bilotti understood this dynamic fully. His calm response to instructions signaled strength, not submission. Yet internally, the cost accumulated. Constant vigilance narrowed perception. Trusting fewer people meant isolation. Maintaining secrecy meant suppressing emotional release. There was no space for doubt, because doubt threatened structure. The world outside continued unchanged. Families gathered for meals. People planned futures. Life moved forward in visible, predictable ways. Inside Bilotti's reality, time moved differently. Days blurred together, measured not by events, but by stability. A quiet day was a successful day. Loyalty also demanded sacrifice. Personal safety became secondary to organizational needs. When risks increased, trusted figures were often placed closest to danger not as punishment but as necessity. Bilotti accepted this placement without complaint. To refuse would have suggested disloyalty. There were moments when obedience required actions that reinforced the system's authority rather than personal benefit. These moments tested resolve. Bilotti responded with the same consistency that had defined his rise. He understood that in this world, authority survived only if it was reinforced without hesitation. This absolute obedience created a paradox. While it offered protection within the structure, it eliminated autonomy. Decisions were no longer personal. Identity became inseparable from role. Bilotti did not see himself as independent from the organization, he was part of it. As enforcement pressure mounted, loyalty became both shield and target. Investigators focused on inner circles, knowing that proximity to power meant access to information. Those closest to leadership carried heightened risk regardless of visibility. Bilotti's low profile protected him externally, but internally it tied him tightly to outcomes beyond his control. The psychological toll of this existence was subtle but profound. Constant restraint suppressed emotional range. Fear was managed, not expressed. Stress was absorbed, not released. Over time, this internalization reshaped behavior. Calm became default, even in situations that would unsettle others. Yet this calm masked vulnerability. When identity is built entirely around obedience, any disruption threatens collapse. Bilotti's strength lay in his consistency, but that same consistency limited adaptability. There was no alternative identity to fall back on. This chapter of his life reveals an uncomfortable truth about criminal systems. Loyalty is demanded absolutely, but protection is conditional. The system rewards obedience while it benefits from it, but it does not guarantee safety when circumstances change. Bilotti continued forward not because the path was safe, but because it was familiar. Commitment had replaced choice. In such systems, leaving is not an option, it is an absence. One does not walk away, one disappears, often involuntarily. From an educational perspective, this reality exposes the illusion of control within organized crime. While it presents itself as structured and disciplined, it strips individuals of agency over time. Loyalty becomes obligation, and obligation becomes confinement. The lesson here is not subtle. Obedience without autonomy leads to dependency. Dependency narrows perspective, and narrowed perspective increases vulnerability. The same loyalty that elevates a person within a system can later become the reason they cannot escape it. Bilotti's journey continued under this weight, steady but increasingly constrained. He remained loyal because loyalty had become his identity. The cost was invisible to outsiders but immense internally. And this is where the myth of power dissolves. True power includes choice. In the world Bilotti served, choice faded with each obedient step forward. What remained was duty, silence, and the constant maintenance of order at personal expense. In the underworld Thomas Bilotti operated within. Silence was never empty. It carried responsibility. It protected secrets, preserved order, and ensured survival. Over time, silence stopped being a tactic and became a burden, one that required constant attention, discipline, and emotional restraint. For Thomas Bilotti, silence was no longer just about not speaking. It was about managing what others believed without ever correcting them. Responsibility increased quietly. There were no announcements, no promotions marked by ceremony. Instead, expectations shifted. More situations required his presence. More moments demanded judgment without instruction. Silence, once a shield, now functioned as a signal of trust. When Bilotti was present and quiet, it meant stability was being maintained. This responsibility extended beyond actions to perception. Others watched how he reacted to tension, how he positioned himself in uncertain moments, how he responded when plans changed unexpectedly. His reactions or lack of them shaped how others behaved. Calm reduced panic. Neutrality discouraged conflict. His silence influenced outcomes more than words ever could. As pressures mounted, responsibility meant containment. Small disputes had to be resolved before they escalated. Misunderstandings required quiet correction. Discipline had to be reinforced subtly, without creating fear or resentment. Bilotti became a regulator of atmosphere, ensuring that tension never crossed into instability. This role demanded emotional intelligence. Understanding people's motivations, insecurities, and limits became essential. Silence was adjusted based on audience. Sometimes it reassured, sometimes it warned, sometimes it created distance. Bilotti mastered these variations without appearing deliberate. His composure seemed natural, which made it effective. But carrying responsibility without expression created internal strain. Every unresolved issue lingered mentally. There was no outlet for stress, no safe space for reflection. The expectation was constant readiness. Responsibility did not pause. It followed him everywhere, shaping decisions even during moments meant to be personal. Time blurred under this weight. Days became sequences of observation and response. There were no clear milestones, only ongoing maintenance. Success was invisible. Failure was immediate and irreversible. This imbalance reinforced caution. Bilotti chose restraint repeatedly, knowing that silence preserved order better than action in most cases. The environment rewarded this restraint. Leaders relied on those who stabilized rather than disrupted. Bilotti's reliability transformed him into an anchor during uncertainty. When situations grew unpredictable, his presence signaled continuity. That signal mattered deeply in a system where perception often outweighed reality. Yet responsibility also isolated. Being seen as a stabilizer meant others projected strength onto him. Few considered the cost of that role. Vulnerability had no place. Asking for support would have undermined confidence. Bilotti absorbed pressure quietly, reinforcing the image others needed to believe. The city outside continued its visible chaos, traffic, noise, movement. Inside this hidden structure, chaos was managed through control. Silence became the primary tool. Bilotti learned to read shifts in tone before words were spoken, to anticipate reactions before decisions were finalized. This anticipation required constant awareness. He monitored not just events but undercurrents. Small changes in behavior signaled larger shifts. A delayed response, an altered routine, a new presence all required attention. Responsibility meant staying ahead of problems without acknowledging them publicly. Over time, silence reshaped identity. Speaking less meant thinking more. Bilotti's internal world grew dense with analysis. He considered consequences continuously, weighing outcomes before acting or choosing not to act. This mental discipline strengthened his role but narrowed his emotional range. The danger of such narrowing is rigidity. Systems evolve. Circumstances change. Silence, while effective, can also delay necessary adaptation. Bilotti balanced this risk carefully, adjusting when absolutely required while maintaining outward consistency. Responsibility also meant accepting blame without acknowledgement. When outcomes disappointed leadership, those closest to the situation felt the pressure even if fault was distributed. Praise was rare. Criticism was subtle. Silence absorbed both equally. From an educational perspective, this stage of Bilotti's life demonstrates how criminal organizations rely heavily on unrecognized labor. The visible figures attract attention, but unseen stabilizers carry much of the operational burden. Their reward is trust, not security. Silence as responsibility creates dependency. The system leans on those who manage complexity quietly, often without contingency plans if they are removed. This reliance increases pressure further, creating a cycle difficult to escape. Bilotti accepted this cycle because alternatives no longer existed. Responsibility had replaced choice. His identity was inseparable from function. Silence was not just a behavior, it was expectation. This chapter reveals a critical lesson. Responsibility without autonomy becomes entrapment. While silence can preserve order, it can also suppress adaptation and personal growth. Systems that demand constant restraint from individuals eventually exhaust them. Yet Bilotti continued forward, steady and composed, not because the burden was light, but because carrying it had become instinctive. Silence was no longer something he chose. It was something he embodied. And in that embodiment lies the deeper truth of his story. Power often rests not in those who speak, but in those who manage consequences quietly. But such power comes at a cost rarely acknowledged, one paid internally over time, in silence. Pressure in the criminal underworld was not explosive. It did not arrive all at once. It accumulated slowly, layering itself over daily routines until it became permanent. For Thomas Bilotti, pressure was not an event, it was an environment. And surviving within that environment required more than strength. It required control so complete that even stress itself became invisible. Every movement carried implication. Where he went, who he spoke to, how long he stayed, nothing existed without consequence. The absence of mistakes did not remove pressure, it intensified it. The more reliable Bilotti became, the more responsibility he absorbed, and the narrower his margin for error grew. Outwardly, nothing changed. That was the point. Pressure was never meant to show. Displaying stress invited speculation. Speculation invited doubt. Doubt weakened trust. Bilotti understood this chain clearly. He maintained consistency in tone, behavior, and presence. Even when internal tension increased, pressure came from all directions. From leadership, there were expectations of stability. From peers, there was constant observation. From outside forces, there was the threat of disruption. Managing these simultaneously required compartmentalization. Bilotti separated concerns mentally, addressing each without allowing overlap. This mental discipline did not develop overnight. It was refined through repetition. Each tense moment survived reinforced the belief that calm was the only acceptable response. Over time, this belief became instinctive. Even situations that might provoke anxiety in others barely registered outwardly. But internally, the cost was real. Living under pressure without release reshaped perception. Time felt compressed. Decisions felt heavier. Sleep became lighter. Yet none of this appeared externally. Bilotti's composure remained intact, reinforcing the illusion that he was unaffected. Pressure also altered relationships. Casual interactions disappeared. Conversations became purposeful. Trust narrowed. The fewer people involved, the fewer variables existed. Bilotti reduced his exposure intentionally, maintaining distance where possible to protect both himself and the structure. The most dangerous aspect of pressure was familiarity. When stress becomes constant, it feels normal. That normalization dulls awareness of risk. Bilotti fought this by maintaining vigilance, reminding himself that complacency was the fastest path to failure. Pressure intensified during periods of uncertainty. When circumstances shifted, when plans required adjustment, when outcomes were unclear, tension increased. These were moments when emotional control mattered most. Bilotti responded by slowing down, not speeding up. Deliberation replaced impulse. This approach influenced others. Calm behavior under pressure stabilized those around him. People mirrored his composure, reducing the likelihood of reactive decisions. In this way, Bilotti's control extended beyond himself. It shaped group dynamics, yet leadership often mistook this stability for immunity. Because Bilotti handled pressure well, more pressure was placed on him. This dynamic is common in rigid systems. Competence attracts burden. Those who manage stress effectively are given more of it. Pressure also meant exposure to risk without acknowledgement. When situations failed, responsibility gravitated toward those closest to the outcome, regardless of intent. Bilotti understood this and accepted it silently. Acceptance preserved trust, even when it deepened personal strain. The psychological effect of constant pressure was subtle erosion. Emotional range narrowed. Joy became muted. Relief was temporary. Everything was filtered through responsibility. Bilotti did not complain because complaining served no function. Endurance was expected. From an educational standpoint, this reveals how criminal hierarchies extract emotional labor. They rely on individuals who internalize stress to preserve collective stability. These individuals are rarely protected proportionally. Pressure also limited foresight. Long-term planning became abstract. The focus remained on immediate stability. Survival replaced ambition. Bilotti lived in this narrowed horizon, aware that future outcomes depended entirely on maintaining control in the present. The city outside offered contrast. People reacted freely to stress. They expressed frustration, fear, relief. Such expression was impossible in Bilotti's world. Expression was vulnerability. Vulnerability invited consequence. Despite this, Bilotti remained functional. His ability to operate under pressure without visible strain made him indispensable, but indispensability carried its own risk. When a system relies too heavily on one stabilizing force, its collapse becomes more likely if that force is removed. Bilotti did not consider removal. He focused on endurance. Each day survived reinforced the belief that control was sustainable. That belief, however, ignored accumulation. Pressure does not disappear, it compounds. This chapter underscores a critical lesson. Sustained pressure without release damages perception and limits adaptability. While composure appears strong, it can mask exhaustion. Systems that demand constant control from individuals eventually reach a breaking point. Bilotti continued forward not because pressure was manageable, but because it was familiar. Familiarity replaced comfort. Control replaced freedom. In that exchange, survival was achieved at the cost of flexibility. And this is the hidden truth behind criminal power structures. They appear resilient because individuals absorb strain privately. But resilience built on silent endurance is fragile. It depends entirely on people who never show the pressure they carry. Thomas Bilotti embodied that endurance. Calm, controlled, and consistent, he lived under constant pressure without showing it. But pressure, even when invisible, always leaves its mark. Security in the criminal world was never absolute. It was an illusion maintained through routine, trust, and the careful management of uncertainty. For Thomas Bilotti, security was not about feeling safe, it was about reducing exposure. The difference mattered. Feeling safe encouraged relaxation. Reducing exposure demanded constant discipline. Trust sat at the center of this illusion. Without trust, nothing functioned. With too much trust, everything became vulnerable. Bilotti learned to balance this contradiction by trusting selectively and verifying continuously. He understood that trust was not static, it shifted with circumstances, behavior, and pressure. Control reinforced trust. Control over routines, information, and responses created predictability. Predictability reduced risk. Bilotti structured his life around controlled patterns. He avoided unnecessary variation. Consistency allowed others to anticipate his behavior, which stabilized interactions. But control also narrowed perspective. When everything is managed tightly, unexpected changes feel disruptive. Bilotti compensated by remaining mentally flexible while maintaining outward consistency. He adapted internally while appearing unchanged externally. Security also depended on perception. If others believed stability existed, they behaved accordingly. Panic often caused more damage than external threats. Bilotti's calm demeanor contributed to this perceived stability. His presence reassured others that order remained intact, yet the illusion required maintenance. Small cracks demanded immediate attention. A rumor, a misunderstanding, a deviation in behavior each had potential to expand if ignored. Bilotti addressed these quietly, minimizing impact without drawing attention. Trust was tested continuously. People changed under pressure. Fear altered priorities. Loyalty weakened when risk increased. Bilotti monitored these shifts carefully, adjusting interactions without confrontation. Distance increased when uncertainty rose. Proximity returned when stability improved. Control extended to information flow. Knowing when to share details and when to withhold them was critical. Oversharing created vulnerability. Undersharing created suspicion. Bilotti navigated this balance with precision, offering enough to reassure without exposing. The illusion of security also depended on boundaries. Clear lines defined acceptable behavior. These boundaries were enforced subtly. Correction occurred privately. Public discipline was avoided whenever possible. Preserving dignity maintained cohesion. Despite these efforts, security remained fragile. External pressure persisted. Internal dynamics evolved. Control slowed disruption but could not eliminate it. Bilotti accepted this reality. His role was not to create permanent safety, but to manage ongoing risk. This constant management demanded attention. Even during quiet periods, vigilance remained. Relaxation invited error. Bilotti treated calm moments as preparation rather than relief. He anticipated disruption even when none appeared imminent. The psychological impact of maintaining security was cumulative. Constant alertness limited emotional engagement. Relationships remained functional rather than intimate. Trust existed within defined parameters, never fully open. From an educational standpoint, this environment demonstrates how criminal systems substitute control for genuine security. They create structures that appear stable while remaining inherently unstable. Individuals like Bilotti sustain these structures through disciplined behavior rather than authority. The illusion of security also masked vulnerability. Because systems appeared controlled, leaders underestimated accumulated risk. Stability bred complacency at higher levels. Those closer to operational reality, like Bilotti, recognized fragility more clearly. Control sometimes required difficult choices. Limiting access meant disappointing allies. Reducing communication meant appearing distant. Bilotti accepted these trade-offs. Preserving security outweighed preserving comfort. Over time, trust became conditional rather than assumed. Each interaction was evaluated against potential risk. Its constant assessment sharpened perception but narrowed empathy. Human relationships became variables rather than connections. Yet within these constraints, Bilotti remained effective. His understanding of trust dynamics allowed him to anticipate shifts before they became crises. This foresight protected the structure longer than visible authority ever could. The illusion of security persisted because individuals like Bilotti maintained it relentlessly. Their efforts were invisible, unacknowledged, and essential. Without them, instability would surface quickly. This chapter highlights a broader lesson. Systems built on control rather than transparency require constant maintenance. They depend on individuals willing to suppress personal needs to preserve collective order. Such systems function until the cost exceeds endurance. Bilotti continued forward, sustaining the illusion because that was his role. Security, however fragile, was preferable to chaos. Control, however demanding, was preferable to exposure. But illusions demand energy, and energy is finite. As pressure accumulated, the gap between perceived security and actual vulnerability widened. Bilotti sensed this gap, even if he could not address it openly. His role allowed management, not transformation. In the end, trust, control, and security formed a delicate balance, one maintained through discipline rather than certainty. Bilotti's life within that balance reveals the hidden mechanics of criminal power, not force alone, but constant, careful management of illusion. Power never stays still. It shifts quietly, often without warning, influenced by pressure, perception, and circumstance. In the underworld Thomas Bilotti navigated, these shifts were rarely announced. They were felt through changes in tone, access, and expectation. For Thomas Bilotti, recognizing these movements early was essential. Stability depended not on stopping change, but on absorbing it without fracture. Shifts in power created uncertainty. Uncertainty invited mistakes. Mistakes attracted attention. Bilotti understood this sequence well. His response was measured adaptation. He adjusted behavior subtly, maintaining continuity while accounting for new realities. This adaptability preserved order when others reacted emotionally. Power shifts often altered relationships. Alliances recalibrated. trust redistributed, access narrowed or expanded. Bilotti observed these changes carefully, noting who gained proximity and who lost it. Such observations guided his decisions without requiring confrontation. Stability during transition required restraint. Acting too quickly risked misalignment. Acting too slowly risked irrelevance. Bilotti balanced this by responding only when necessary, allowing developments to clarify before committing. Pressure intensified during these periods. Expectations changed. Ambiguity increased. Communication became more guarded. Bilotti maintained calm consistency, signaling reliability amid uncertainty. This signal mattered deeply when others felt unsettled. Shifts also exposed ambition. Some individuals attempted to reposition themselves aggressively, others withdrew. Bilotti avoided both extremes. He neither advanced nor retreated. His steadiness provided continuity when structure felt uncertain. Control over emotion became critical. Power transitions often triggered fear or overconfidence. Bilotti suppressed both. Emotional neutrality allowed clearer assessment. He evaluated risk pragmatically, focusing on outcomes rather than intent. Stability required protecting routines. Familiar patterns reassured participants. Bilotti preserved these patterns wherever possible, minimizing disruption. Where change was unavoidable, he implemented it gradually, reducing shock. Information flow became more sensitive. During transitions, rumors multiplied. Bilotti limited exposure to speculation, relying on verified signals rather than noise. This discipline prevented reactive decisions based on incomplete understanding. Power shifts also tested loyalty. Allegiances were examined implicitly. Behavior during uncertainty revealed priorities. Bilotti demonstrated loyalty through consistency rather than declarations. This approach reinforced trust without provoking suspicion. Yet stability during transition carried risk. Being associated with continuity could be misinterpreted as resistance to change. Bilotti navigated this by remaining adaptable internally while appearing neutral externally. Flexibility without visibility preserved his position. The psychological toll of transition was significant. Constant reassessment required mental energy. Bilotti remained vigilant, aware that complacency during change invited failure. His focus narrowed further, prioritizing essential interactions. From an educational perspective, power transitions reveal the fragility of hierarchical systems. Stability depends less on authority and more on individuals, capable of managing uncertainty quietly. These individuals often operate without recognition. Bilotti's effectiveness during these moments reinforced his value. When outcomes remained controlled despite change, leadership attributed success to structure rather than individuals. This invisibility protected him, but it also concealed his contribution. Transitions also exposed the limits of control. Not all variables could be managed. External pressure, internal ambition, and unforeseen events introduced unpredictability. Bilotti accepted this reality, focusing on mitigation rather than elimination of risk. The illusion of permanence dissolved during shifts. Nothing felt fixed. Bilotti adapted by anchoring to principles rather than positions. Discipline, restraint, and observation guided his actions more than hierarchy. Stability was maintained through repetition. Consistent behavior created familiarity. Familiarity reduced anxiety. Bilotti embodied this repetition, reinforcing calm through predictability. Yet repetition risked rigidity. Bilotti countered this by remaining mentally flexible, updating assessments continuously. Adaptation occurred internally first, externally later. This sequencing preserved coherence. Power shifts eventually settled. New balances formed. Roles clarified. Stability returned, though altered. Bilotti adjusted seamlessly, integrating changes without signaling strain. His survival depended on appearing unaffected. This chapter underscores a vital lesson. Power is transient. Stability is constructed. Those who endure understand both truths. They do not cling to authority or resist change. They manage transition quietly, minimizing disruption. Bilotti's experience illustrates how control during uncertainty shapes outcomes. Loud reactions destabilize. Silent adaptation preserves order. In systems built on perception, managing appearance matters as much as managing reality. As stability re-emerged, pressure eased slightly but vigilance remained. Every transition left residue. Trust recalibrated. Exposure shifted. Bilotti absorbed these changes without acknowledgement. In the end, power shifts did not elevate him visibly, but they confirmed his role as a stabilizer. He remained where stability required him to be close enough to manage uncertainty, distant enough to avoid attention. And this is the paradox of endurance. Those who preserve order during change often remain unseen, yet without them systems collapse. Authority in the underworld was never absolute. It existed on a narrow path, bordered on one side by control and on the other by exposure. Walking that path required precision. A single misstep could shift perception from strength to vulnerability. For Thomas Bilotti, navigating this space became a daily exercise in balance, asserting presence without inviting attention, enforcing order without revealing structure. Authority was conveyed through behavior rather than declaration. Tone mattered, timing mattered, presence mattered. Bilotti understood that authority worked best when it appeared effortless. When people adjusted their behavior around him without instruction, authority had succeeded. When instruction was required, something had already weakened. Exposure, however, was constant. Every assertion of authority created a trace someone noticed, someone remembered, someone talked. Bilotti minimized these traces by choosing restraint. He intervened selectively, allowing systems to regulate themselves whenever possible. Intervention was reserved for moments where inaction posed greater risk than visibility. This selective enforcement shaped perception. Others saw consistency without understanding the mechanics behind it. They complied because stability persisted. Compliance reduced the need for escalation. Escalation increased exposure. The cycle reinforced itself. Authority also depended on credibility. Credibility came from outcomes, not appearances. When problems were resolved quietly, authority grew. When disruptions lingered, it eroded. Bilotti focused on outcomes, often letting others take credit if it reduced his visibility. Authority did not require recognition to function. Exposure increased with proximity to sensitive decisions. The closer one stood to outcomes, the more likely responsibility would attach. Bilotti managed this by maintaining a buffer, being informed enough to act, but distant enough to avoid attribution. This buffer was psychological as much as physical. Communication played a critical role. Direct language invited records and recollection. Indirect language preserved deniability. Bilotti favored implication over instruction, allowing others to infer expectation. This approach reduced explicit accountability while maintaining control. The environment rewarded such subtlety. Systems built on discretion valued those who preserved it. Bilotti's measured approach kept attention diffused. No single action defined him. No pattern stood out. Authority blended into routine. Yet routine itself carried risk. Repetition created predictability. Predictability invited analysis. Bilotti countered this by varying minor details while preserving core behavior. The pattern existed, but it was difficult to isolate. Exposure also emerged through association. Being seen too often with certain individuals linked outcomes. Bilotti managed proximity carefully, rotating interactions and limiting public alignment. Relationships remained functional rather than demonstrative. Internal challenges tested this balance. Disputes required resolution. Authority had to be exercised to prevent fragmentation. Bilotti handled these moments privately, preserving public calm. Privacy limited exposure. Calm preserved authority. The psychological strain of maintaining this balance was significant. Constant calculation replaced spontaneity. Every action passed through a filter of consequence. Bilotti accepted this cost as necessary. Authority without calculation was recklessness. From an educational standpoint, this illustrates how power functions in covert systems. Authority is most effective when it is least visible. Exposure grows when authority seeks validation. Bilotti avoided validation entirely. The narrow path also required adaptability. Conditions changed. What reduced exposure one day might increase it the next. Bilotti reassessed, continuously adjusting thresholds for action. Flexibility preserved balance. External pressure complicated matters. Investigative focus intensified unpredictably. In such moments, authority had to recede without collapsing. Bilotti scaled back visibility, allowing systems to operate autonomously. Authority persisted through structure rather than presence. Exposure was also psychological. The more authority one exercised, the more one felt responsible for outcomes. This internal exposure could influence behavior, leading to overcorrection. Bilotti guarded against this by maintaining emotional distance. Responsibility did not require attachment. This distance, however, narrowed personal engagement. Relationships remained bounded by role. Trust existed within defined limits. Authority demanded separation. Despite these constraints, Bilotti remained effective. His authority endured because it did not compete for attention. It existed as a stabilizing force rather than a commanding one. Others adjusted because stability benefited them. The narrow path between authority and exposure never widened. It demanded constant attention. Bilotti walked it deliberately, aware that comfort invited risk. Balance required vigilance. The lesson embedded here is clear. In systems that punish visibility, true authority operates quietly. It relies on structure, consistency, and restraint. Exposure is not an event. It is a gradual accumulation. Preventing it requires disciplined behavior over time. Bilotti's ability to maintain this balance sustained order longer than overt control ever could. He demonstrated that authority does not need to announce itself to function. It needs only to be reliable. As time passed, the path narrowed further. Pressure increased, margins shrank. Bilotti adjusted accordingly, reducing action, increasing observation. Authority persisted, exposure remained managed. And this is the reality behind hidden power. It survives not through dominance, but through careful navigation of limits. Those who endure understand where authority ends and exposure begins, and they never confuse the two. There comes a moment in every closed system when loyalty stops being a choice and becomes a condition of survival. It is no longer tested through small decisions or quiet demonstration. It hardens into something permanent, something irreversible. For Thomas Bilotti, this moment arrived not with drama, but with clarity. Loyalty had crossed a threshold, and there was no path back to neutrality. At this stage, loyalty was no longer about proving commitment. It was assumed. Expectations shifted accordingly. What once required discretion now required presence. What once allowed distance now demanded alignment. Bilotti recognized this shift immediately. The space between involvement and responsibility narrowed until it disappeared entirely. This was the point where trust and dependency merged. Leadership relied not only on Bilotti's actions, but on his judgment. Silence now carried implied consent. Presence signaled agreement. Absence would have raised questions. Loyalty had become structural. With this shift came inevitability. When outcomes succeeded, the system absorbed the benefit. When outcomes failed, responsibility concentrated. Those deeply embedded could not redirect blame outward. Proximity ensured accountability, whether visible or not. Bilotti adapted by tightening control further. He refined routines, reduced exposure, and eliminated unnecessary interaction. Efficiency replaced flexibility. Every action served stability. There was no margin for personal deviation. Loyalty at this level required suppression of instinct. Self-preservation impulses had to align with organizational preservation. When these conflicted, the organization prevailed. Bilotti accepted this without hesitation. Hesitation itself would have signaled fracture. The psychological transformation was subtle. Over time, Bilotti stopped evaluating decisions in personal terms. Outcomes were assessed solely through impact on structure. Personal consequence became secondary, almost abstract. This detachment allowed function but narrowed perspective. External pressure amplified this effect. Increased scrutiny meant mistakes carried heavier consequences. Loyalty demanded endurance under intensified risk. Bilotti's composure remained intact, reinforcing trust even as pressure mounted. Relationships adjusted accordingly. Familiarity decreased. Interaction became purposeful. Loyalty required distance from anything unpredictable. Bilotti limited his circle further, reducing variables. Isolation increased, but control improved. This isolation was not loneliness in the conventional sense. It was functional separation. Emotional engagement was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Bilotti maintained connections where required, but depth was avoided. Depth created obligation beyond role. The point of no return also redefined fear. Fear no longer centered on consequences. It centered on failure to maintain order. The idea of destabilization carried more weight than personal risk. This inversion of priorities signaled full integration into the system. From an educational perspective, This moment illustrates how loyalty evolves within criminal hierarchies. It begins as alignment, progresses to obligation, and ultimately becomes identity. At that final stage, separation is not just difficult, it is inconceivable. Bilotti's actions reflected this integration. He anticipated needs without instruction. He adjusted behavior preemptively. Leadership rarely needed to intervene. This autonomy, paradoxically, deepened dependency. The system relied on his internalized discipline. Yet autonomy without exit is confinement. Bilotti's independence existed entirely within defined limits. He could act freely only in ways that preserved structure. Anything outside that scope was irrelevant. The illusion of choice persisted superficially. Decisions appeared voluntary. In reality, outcomes were predetermined by loyalty. Bilotti understood this fully. Acceptance replaced resistance. Control replaced conflict. This stage also clarified risk distribution. Those less embedded retained flexibility. Those deeply loyal carried permanence. Bilotti belonged firmly in the latter category. His value lay in his consistency, but that consistency bound him tightly. The environment reinforced this binding. Others deferred instinctively. Expectations aligned around his presence. Removing himself would have disrupted balance. Stability depended on continuity. The cost of this role was invisibility. Success went unnoticed. Failure would be magnified. Bilotti accepted this asymmetry. Recognition was unnecessary. Survival of structure mattered more. As time passed, loyalty no longer felt heavy. It felt normal. Normalization masked sacrifice. What once required effort now felt automatic. This transition completed the point of no return. The lesson embedded here is profound. Loyalty without limits eliminates escape. Systems that demand total alignment offer stability in exchange for autonomy. Once accepted, that exchange cannot be reversed without consequence. Bilotti's journey into this stage was not forced. It was gradual, reinforced by routine and reward. Each step made the next inevitable. By the time awareness fully formed, alternatives no longer existed. This reality challenges popular myths about power and choice within criminal systems. Advancement does not create freedom. It reduces options. The higher one rises within rigid structures, the fewer paths remain. Bilotti continued forward because stopping was no longer possible. Loyalty had become identity. Identity had become function. Function had become survival. And this is the quiet truth behind unwavering allegiance. It is not always driven by belief. Often, it is driven by momentum. Once enough distance is placed between the present and the exit, turning back ceases to be an option. In that space where loyalty becomes irreversible, clarity replaces illusion. Bilotti understood exactly where he stood. The system stood with him, and he stood with it. Whatever came next would be faced without hesitation, because hesitation had already been left behind. Responsibility, unlike authority or loyalty, is seldom celebrated. It is quiet, pervasive, and relentless. In the world Thomas Bilotti inhabited, responsibility existed as an invisible weight, pressing on every decision, every step, and every interaction. For Thomas Bilotti, the weight of responsibility was constant, unseen by the outside world, and far heavier than the visible burdens carried by others. Responsibility meant being the one others relied upon when situations became complicated, dangerous, or uncertain. It meant absorbing tension and translating it into order. Even when outcomes were out of his control, the expectation was that Bilotti's presence alone would stabilize the environment. This invisible expectation shaped his behavior and defined his standing. The first aspect of this burden was anticipation. Every situation required foresight. What could go wrong? Who might act unpredictably? What chain of consequences might follow from a single misstep? Bilotti analyzed these questions continuously, creating mental simulations to prepare for every eventuality. In his mind, outcomes of decisions were never abstract. They were lived experiences, calculated before action. Responsibility also meant containment. Small disruptions, disagreements, or misunderstandings needed to be resolved before they escalated. A minor error could ripple outward if not managed, causing larger problems. Bilotti absorbed these disturbances silently, often solving conflicts before they were noticed by others. His interventions were invisible but critical. Another layer of responsibility was risk management. Being close to leadership placed him in positions where exposure could have catastrophic consequences. He had to measure every action against potential scrutiny from law enforcement, rivals, and internal factions alike. Every movement, every interaction, every word had to be considered not only for immediate effect, but for long-term impact. The invisible burden extended into personal life. Unlike ordinary roles where work and personal time can be separated, Bilotti's responsibility permeated every aspect of existence. Travel, leisure, even minor social interactions were constrained by the implications they carried. A single lapse outside the system could reflect internally, undermining the stability he worked to maintain. Mental strain accompanied this constant vigilance. Bilotti rarely displayed stress outwardly, but internally, every day demanded focus, calculation, and control. Emotional expression had to be limited, as vulnerability could compromise perception. The system rewarded composure, not confession. Silence was both a tool and a necessity. Speaking unnecessarily could reveal knowledge, intentions, or vulnerabilities. Remaining quiet allowed him to maintain control without creating exposure. This discipline was exhausting, yet it was essential. The burden of responsibility made every word carry potential consequence. Responsibility also meant absorbing blame. In a system where loyalty and obedience are absolute, when outcomes failed, those closest to the process shouldered consequences, regardless of intent. Bilotti internalized this principle. Failures were never blamed externally. They were managed quietly, resolved, or mitigated, leaving the system functioning while his role remained largely unrecognized. The paradox of responsibility is that the more one is relied upon, the more constrained one becomes. Autonomy shrinks as obligations grow. Bilotti could act freely only within strict limits. Decisions outside these bounds were dangerous, even if logical. The structure demanded alignment, and alignment demanded adherence, not improvisation. This invisible burden demanded continuous learning. The dynamics of the system changed frequently. External pressures, internal ambitions, and rivalries created shifting terrain. Bilotti had to stay ahead, observing trends, understanding nuances, and anticipating shifts. Failure to adjust even subtly could lead to exposure, conflict, or misalignment. At its core, responsibility created a form of invisible leadership. Bilotti influenced outcomes not through overt action, but through presence, observation, and subtle intervention. Others often remained unaware of his contributions. Stability appeared to emerge naturally, but it was maintained through his constant diligence. Yet the burden was isolating. Because few understood the full scope of responsibility, Bilotti's perspective remained largely solitary. Conversations were constrained by what could be revealed safely. Trust was limited. Misinterpretation carried consequences. This isolation reinforced the weight, as the pressure could not be shared openly. There was also moral complexity. Responsibility required enforcing rules and ensuring outcomes, sometimes through actions others might question morally. Bilotti compartmentalized these acts, viewing them as functional rather than personal. Success and survival required separating identity from judgment. Time itself was reshaped by responsibility. Days were measured not by personal milestones, but by outcomes, stability, and reaction to shifting conditions. Success was quiet, failure immediate. Bilotti's rhythm was dictated by necessity, not desire. From an educational perspective, this chapter illustrates how responsibility operates invisibly in high-stakes systems. Those relied upon most heavily are rarely visible, their efforts absorbed by the functioning of the larger structure. Without their discipline, chaos would erupt. Recognition is optional, survival is not. Despite the weight, Bilotti's presence was steady. His ability to manage multiple layers of consequence without outward strain made him indispensable. Leadership depended on him, peers deferred to him, and rivals measured his presence carefully. Stability, continuity, and order were extensions of his disciplined execution of responsibility. The lesson embedded here is subtle but powerful. Responsibility can be heavier than authority, more binding than loyalty, and more isolating than power. It is a burden carried quietly, shaping outcomes while remaining largely invisible. Those who endure it develop unparalleled discipline, focus, and foresight. Bilotti continued forward under this invisible weight, aware that his survival and the survival of the system depended not on recognition, but on constant, precise management of every variable. Authority, loyalty, and control converged through his discipline, creating stability in a world defined by unpredictability. And this is the essence of responsibility in hidden systems. It is quiet, pervasive, and exacting. Those who manage it without faltering become the unseen foundation upon which entire structures endure. Bilotti was one of those foundations, carrying the weight so others could operate without awareness. Influence in the criminal underworld was rarely flamboyant. It rarely appeared in dramatic gestures or public displays. For Thomas Bilotti, influence was invisible, subtle and pervasive, exerted without declaration and felt without acknowledgement. Thomas Bilotti understood early that the real power of influence lay not in controlling others overtly, but in shaping outcomes indirectly, steering decisions through perception, presence, and quiet judgment. The mechanics of this influence were delicate. It operated through observation first. Bilotti watched, listened, and assessed. He understood the motivations driving people's actions, the fears they concealed, the ambitions they disguised, the alliances they balanced. From these insights, he could anticipate behavior before it manifested. Influence, then, was preemptive. It was about shaping the environment so that outcomes aligned with his understanding of stability. He seldom issued commands. Words could create friction or unintended attention. Instead, influence was executed through subtle signals, a glance, a shift in posture, the strategic placement of presence. Those around him adjusted instinctively. They reacted to his reliability, his consistency, his judgment without needing explanation. This indirect approach demanded patience. Immediate results were rare. Influence accumulated slowly, layered over time, reinforced by repeated demonstrations of competence and discretion. Bilotti understood that the most effective influence was invisible precisely because it went unrecognized. Those who sought overt control often destabilized the very systems they tried to govern. Bilotti avoided that pitfall. Access was central to influence. Proximity to decision-makers allowed him to observe, advise silently, and intervene when necessary. Being present in critical moments was enough. He rarely dictated outcomes. Instead, his steady presence reassured others that decisions would be implemented without error, making his input more persuasive by default. Yet influence carried responsibility. A single miscalculation could cascade into chaos. Bilotti was careful to verify information, observe nuances, and anticipate reactions. Influence without foresight risked exposure and failure. Every calculated move had to consider multiple variables simultaneously: loyalty, perception, timing, and consequence. He also understood the role of credibility. Influence without trust is meaningless. Bilotti's credibility was built through years of consistency delivering results, maintaining discretion, and acting reliably in high-pressure situations. Those around him knew he could be depended upon, which made his subtle guidance persuasive without force. Influence required restraint. Unlike others who sought dominance or visibility, Bilotti allowed others to take credit for outcomes he had shaped. The effectiveness of his methods was judged by result, not recognition. By remaining in the background, he maintained mobility, reduced scrutiny, and minimized risk while maximizing impact. Psychologically, wielding influence invisibly demanded control. Bilotti monitored his own reactions to avoid unintentionally signaling bias, emotion, or preference. Neutrality was a tool as powerful as intervention. By remaining composed, he encouraged predictability in others. Stability, in turn, reinforced his influence. External pressures often tested this system. Shifts in alliances, law enforcement attention, and internal rivalries could expose miscalculation. Bilotti adjusted subtly, reinforcing his presence and influence through observation and minimal intervention. He understood that visibility increases risk, while invisibility preserves authority. Relationships were central to his strategy. Influence required nuanced interaction. He positioned himself where it mattered, engaged when necessary, and withdrew when observation alone was sufficient. Personal connections were maintained strategically, not socially. Every interaction was functional, serving either assessment or alignment. Influence also relied on timing. Intervening too early could preempt decisions, causing disruption. Waiting too long could allow errors to solidify. Bilotti refined a keen sense for timing, acting in precise moments when subtle action could shift outcomes without detection. This unseen influence extended across operational structures. It ensured that routines were maintained, conflicts resolved quietly, and systems functioned efficiently. Leadership benefited from his judgment without needing to intervene directly. The organization operated as if self-regulated, but its cohesion depended heavily on Bilotti as silent orchestration. From an educational perspective, this chapter demonstrates a fundamental truth about hidden power. The most effective influence is often invisible. Overt control attracts resistance, attention, and risk. Quiet guidance stabilizes, directs, and preserves structures without creating vulnerability. Bilotti's skill lay in applying this principle consistently. Yet the burden of invisible influence was heavy. Continuous observation, calculated response, and subtle intervention required constant mental engagement. Mistakes could not be public, misinterpretations could not be allowed, and lapses in attention were unacceptable. The cost was isolation and fatigue. Despite this, Bilotti remained unwavering. He understood that influence was more enduring than authority or recognition. Systems that operate smoothly under invisible guidance are resilient. Those that rely on display are fragile. His role exemplified how subtlety sustains order where overpower cannot. The lesson embedded here is clear. True influence does not demand acknowledgement. It operates quietly, often unnoticed, shaping behavior and outcomes through consistency, credibility, and timing. Visibility is a liability. Discretion is strength. Bilotti's life reflected mastery of these principles. By controlling perception, guiding without directive, and acting without exposure, he preserved stability and mitigated risk. Leadership benefited, peers deferred, and the system endured, all without overt demonstration of authority. In this way, invisible influence became the foundation of his effectiveness. It was not flashy, it was not dramatic, but it was enduring. And in a world defined by unpredictability, it was indispensable. Proximity to power carries both privilege and peril. For Thomas Bilotti, being close to the inner workings of the Gambino crime family meant access, influence, and trust. But it also meant exposure, risk, and constant scrutiny. Thomas Bilotti knew that walking near power was a delicate balance. One misstep could turn advantage into liability in an instant. Closeness to leadership provided insight. Bilotti observed decisions, strategies, and personalities firsthand. He understood motivations, priorities, and potential fractures within the system. This knowledge allowed him to anticipate shifts before they became crises. He could position himself where influence mattered most, subtly guiding outcomes while maintaining a low profile. Yet with insight came responsibility. Being near power meant that mistakes carried immediate consequences. Misjudged reactions, delayed interventions, or misunderstood intentions could draw scrutiny or distrust. Proximity magnified error. Bilotti internalized this reality and adapted by maintaining precision in every move, measuring both action and inaction against potential fallout. Relationships within this sphere were layered with complexity. Loyalty, alliance, and perception intersected constantly. Bilotti had to navigate competing ambitions, hidden agendas, and the unspoken expectations of leaders. A careless word could signal preference, bias, or dissent. Silence, discretion, observation became his tools, allowing him to interact without revealing vulnerability. Exposure was another unavoidable cost. Presence in the inner circle placed Bilotti under continuous observation from peers, rivals, and law enforcement. Every action, public or private, could be analyzed for meaning. He learned to move with purpose but without ostentation, balancing visibility with subtlety. The psychological weight of this closeness was immense. Responsibility, vigilance, and the constant need for composure left little space for emotional release. Bilotti's mind was always active, scanning for risk, evaluating consequence, and anticipating the next shift in dynamics. There was no pause, no retreat. The proximity that granted him power also demanded perpetual engagement. Influence, in this context, was inseparable from caution. Bilotti's ability to guide outcomes relied on his ability to remain unnoticed while remaining effective. He did not lead through spectacle. He led through anticipation, timing, and subtle intervention. The inner circle depended on his presence, even if the depth of that dependence remained unspoken. This closeness also created vulnerability. Those who stood near power are often targeted first when conflicts arise, whether from law enforcement, rival factions, or internal dissent. Bilotti understood that survival required not just loyalty, but discretion and adaptability. Any visible alignment could be interpreted as a threat or weakness. He managed this balance with careful observation, strategic withdrawal, and measured engagement. Closeness to power magnified every human flaw. Ambition, jealousy, and impatience were no longer abstract, they became factors in daily interactions. Bilotti navigated these undercurrents, aligning outwardly without exposing personal preference. Relationships were functional rather than personal, alliances based on necessity rather than trust. Responsibility intensified further because he was relied upon to maintain stability. Leadership assumed his presence would prevent errors from escalating. His judgment was trusted without verification. This level of confidence was a reward, but it also meant accountability was concentrated. Failures near him could not be deflected. The burden was internalized, silent and enduring. Proximity also demanded emotional compartmentalization. Personal feelings, opinions, and fears could not interfere with decisions. Bilotti had to detach from consequences he could not control, absorbing responsibility while maintaining calm. Emotional display, hesitation, or questioning undermined perception. In the inner circle, composure was currency, and Bilotti spent it judiciously. Access provided advantages, but it was not freedom. His autonomy existed within strict limits. Decisions outside organizational priorities were irrelevant. Every choice, whether minor or critical, was filtered through the lens of maintaining stability. Personal ambition had to align perfectly with institutional survival, or risk became imminent. From an educational perspective, closeness to power highlights a paradox. Proximity offers influence, but also reduces flexibility. The higher one rises in a structured hierarchy, the more decisions are constrained by responsibility, loyalty, and scrutiny. Advantage comes at the cost of personal freedom. External pressures intensified the stakes. Investigations, rivalries, and operational crises placed those closest to power under heightened risk. Bilotti's survival depended not on bold moves, but on disciplined navigation, careful observation, timing, and calculated restraint. Every visible action was a signal, every misstep amplified. The weight of closeness shaped behavior continuously. Bilotti reduced exposure wherever possible, limited unnecessary interactions, and controlled perception. He maintained influence without demanding recognition, guiding outcomes quietly. Others saw the effect of his presence, but not its depth. Yet this closeness also created identity. Bilotti became defined by proximity. His value, responsibilities, and survival were inseparable from his position near leadership. Detachment was impossible, retreat meant dissolution. Being close to power became both privilege and prison. This chapter illustrates a critical truth. Those near power operate in a dual reality. They benefit from influence and access, yet live under constant scrutiny and amplified risk. Their skill lies in navigating both, maintaining stability while remaining largely invisible. Bilotti exemplified this mastery. Closeness to power is a narrow path. It offers insight, influence, and access, but demands vigilance, discipline, and detachment. Mistakes are magnified, misinterpretation is constant, and autonomy is limited. Yet those who endure and adapt, like Bilotti, shape outcomes profoundly without ever stepping into the spotlight. The lesson embedded here is enduring proximity to power is not inherently safe or liberating. It requires balance, discretion, and constant assessment. Those who master this duality ensure survival, maintain order, and wield influence quietly, even in the most dangerous environments. Thomas Bilotti continued to operate under this weight, aware that every decision, interaction, and gesture was amplified by proximity. Yet he remained steady, disciplined, and precise, exemplifying the unrecognized skill required to survive and shape outcomes at the center of power. Threats were never announced with clarity in the world Thomas Bilotti inhabited. They emerged gradually, often disguised as opportunity, coincidence, or routine disruption. For Thomas Bilotti, survival depended on recognizing these threats early, understanding their nature, and neutralizing them without creating unnecessary exposure. Navigating danger without losing ground required discipline, awareness, and subtle strategy. Threats came in many forms. There were external dangers, rival factions testing limits, law enforcement closing in on operations, or unpredictable public events that could create scrutiny. There were internal dangers, ambition among peers, hidden dissent, miscommunication, and lapses in loyalty. Every threat demanded response calibrated precisely to avoid escalation. Acting too boldly could invite retaliation, acting too slowly could allow chaos to spread. Bilotti's approach relied on observation first. He never assumed that a potential threat was obvious to others. He analyzed behavior, monitored communication patterns, and evaluated intentions. Subtle cues, a change in tone, a delayed response, a new association, were signals that informed his next moves. By understanding the nature of each threat, he could respond in ways that preserved stability and minimized attention. Timing was crucial. Responding prematurely risked revealing awareness, while waiting too long allowed the threat to grow. Bilotti developed a keen sense for the right moment, acting when the potential for mitigation was highest yet visibility was lowest. His interventions were rarely noticed directly, but their effects were felt immediately through the maintenance of order. Control of perception was a key strategy. Those around him had to believe that situations were contained even when they were not fully resolved. By managing appearance, Bilotti prevented panic, rumor, and speculation from creating secondary threats. Calm under pressure reassured allies and dissuaded rivals, reinforcing his influence without overt assertion. Subtlety extended to information. Bilotti controlled the flow carefully, ensuring only essential parties knew the details required for effective action. Overt exposure invited scrutiny, misinterpretation, and potential manipulation. Minimal communication maximized security. This discipline required patience and restraint, particularly when others demanded explanation or immediate transparency. Loyalty played a critical role in threat management. Those closest to him acted as extensions of his oversight. Bilotti cultivated these relationships carefully, maintaining alignment while avoiding dependency on emotional attachment. Trust in execution, rather than personal bonds, was the measure of reliability. Misalignment could compromise response and create additional risk. Flexibility was equally important. Threats were rarely static. What appeared dangerous in one moment could transform into opportunity the next. Bilotti maintained mental agility, adjusting strategy while preserving core stability. This adaptability allowed him to absorb shocks without losing ground, keeping systems functioning even under duress. Pressure intensified during moments of transition. As power shifted or circumstances changed, vulnerabilities became more visible. Bilotti doubled his vigilance, monitoring both external pressures and internal dynamics. Awareness of context allowed him to anticipate the interplay of forces, giving him the advantage to intervene quietly before threats materialized fully. The psychological dimension of navigating threats was substantial. Constant awareness, careful assessment, and measured action demanded mental resilience. Emotional impulses could not interfere. Anger, fear, or impatience would compromise judgment, potentially exposing weaknesses. Bilotti cultivated discipline over instinct, prioritizing strategy over reaction. Decision-making in these situations required weighing multiple outcomes simultaneously. Every action carried consequence, and inaction was itself a decision. Bilotti's approach was methodical. He evaluated risk, impact, and visibility continuously, ensuring that every move preserved balance while minimizing exposure. Isolation was a natural byproduct. Those capable of managing threats at his level were few. Sharing responsibility risked dilution of control. Bilotti operated in a space where reliance on others was limited, increasing the burden but preserving precision. His independence allowed him to act decisively without compromise. From an educational standpoint, this chapter demonstrates the mechanics of covert crisis management. Effective threat navigation does not rely on overt confrontation. It relies on observation, timing, control of perception, and subtle intervention. The highest levels of influence are often invisible because the most effective strategies operate beneath the surface. Even in moments of extreme risk, Bilotti's composure provided stability. His silent authority reassured those around him, diffused tension, and contained potential escalation. Influence, trust, and discipline converged to create a resilient system capable of withstanding external and internal pressures. Yet navigating threats required continuous vigilance. Danger never fully disappeared, it merely receded temporarily. Bilotti understood that complacency was the enemy of survival. Each situation demanded renewed assessment and adaptation. He remained mentally alert, aware that the cost of error could be immediate and irreversible. The lesson here is clear. Survival near power depends not on dominance or aggression, but on disciplined perception and strategic subtlety. Acting decisively without attracting attention, controlling the flow of information, and maintaining stability in uncertain conditions are the hallmarks of enduring influence. Thomas Bilotti's mastery of threat management was quite absolute. His interventions shaped outcomes, preserved authority, and reinforced the system without overt demonstration. In a world defined by volatility, his ability to navigate danger without losing ground exemplified both skill and discipline. This balance of vigilance, restraint, and subtle influence is what separates those who endure from those who falter. Power may attract attention, but survival relies on the ability to manage risk invisibly, ensuring continuity, even when the environment is hostile. In the end, Bilotti's world demanded constant adaptation. Threats never ceased, but mastery over observation, timing, and perception allowed him to maintain control. Stability was not given, it was earned, minute by minute, decision by decision, in a quiet mastery that others rarely noticed but always relied upon. Order in the underworld is fragile. It is not maintained through ideology, fairness, or morality. It is maintained through enforcement, reputation, and the careful calibration of consequence. For Thomas Bilotti, enforcement was never loud or theatrical. It was silent, pervasive, and highly effective. Thomas Bilotti understood that true control was achieved not by intimidation alone, but by shaping expectations and behaviors subtly, consistently, and invisibly. Silent enforcement begins with perception. Those around Bilotti learned quickly that behavior had consequences not through overt punishment, but through consistent response. A misplaced word, a delayed task, or a sign of disloyalty was noted, assessed, and counterbalanced without fanfare. People adjusted instinctively. The system corrected itself before open conflict arose. This method relied on patience. Immediate reaction could escalate tension unnecessarily. Bilotti observed first, allowing behavior to reveal intent, patterns, and risk. He responded precisely, ensuring the minimum action required to maintain order while avoiding exposure. The effect was quiet compliance. The impression was stability, even when enforcement was subtle and decisive. Influence and enforcement were intertwined. Bilotti did not need to assert power vocally. His presence alone, his reputation for consistency and precision, ensured alignment. Authority was reinforced not through threat alone, but through the expectation that deviation would not go unnoticed and would be managed efficiently. Internal discipline was crucial. Bilotti maintained composure in every scenario, regardless of provocation. His calm demeanor functioned as both a stabilizing force and an instrument of silent enforcement. Emotional reactions could signal weakness or create uncertainty. By controlling his own response, he guided behavior without overt action. The mechanics of enforcement required careful observation of relationships, alliances, and loyalties. Bilotti tracked interactions, noting subtle shifts in tone, association, and decision-making. These signals indicated potential risk before it became actionable. Intervention could then occur quietly, preserving stability while correcting course. Timing remained a critical factor. Intervening too early risked revealing awareness or prompting defensive behavior. Waiting too long allowed minor issues to grow into larger problems. Bilotti perfected the art of subtle timing, intervening at the precise moment when action could shape outcomes without attracting attention. Information control complemented enforcement. People operated under the impression of autonomy, but their choices were influenced by the careful flow of knowledge. Bilotti shared only what was necessary, ensuring that decision-making aligned with broader organizational priorities. Miscommunication and rumor were minimized, further strengthening silent authority. The psychological impact of this approach was profound. Those under Bilotti's oversight internalized expectations, adjusting behavior proactively to avoid consequences. Enforcement became self-regulating. The system maintained order without overt displays of control. Compliance became habitual rather than coerced. Yet silent enforcement was not passive. It required constant engagement, mental mapping, and risk assessment. Bilotti anticipated potential disruptions before they materialized, adjusting his strategy proactively. The appearance of calm masked the continuous calculations that maintained order. Proximity to power amplified both the responsibility and the risk of enforcement. Actions taken in close quarters with leadership or influential peers carried greater consequence. Bilotti navigated these dynamics by acting subtly, ensuring that outcomes reinforced authority without creating scrutiny or resistance. This method also extended to external threats. Rival factions, law enforcement, and unforeseen events all required discreet management. Bilotti's interventions minimized exposure, maintained operational stability, and ensured that outcomes aligned with internal priorities. The system functioned as though self-regulating, but in reality it relied heavily on his continuous oversight. The lesson here is instructive. True enforcement does not always rely on visible force. It relies on anticipation, consistency, subtle guidance, and disciplined observation. Those who master silent enforcement shape behavior and preserve order far more effectively than those who rely solely on intimidation or spectacle. Relationships played a functional role. Bilotti maintained connections to ensure compliance, gather information, and influence outcomes. Personal attachment was secondary to purpose. Alliances were managed strategically, and distance was maintained where necessary to preserve objectivity. Over time, the impact of silent enforcement became self-reinforcing. Expectations solidified. Individuals adjusted behavior preemptively. Stability increased. Fewer interventions were required because compliance had become internalized. Bilotti's effectiveness was measured by the absence of disruption rather than the presence of action. From an educational standpoint, this illustrates a principle often overlooked. Power is not always visible, and enforcement does not always require confrontation. Stability can be maintained quietly through reputation, observation, and the disciplined management of consequence. Yet the cost was significant. The constant engagement required mental focus, emotional control, and personal discipline. Fatigue was inevitable, but exposure or error was not an option. Bilotti absorbed responsibility quietly, ensuring continuity without recognition. The culmination of this approach is enduring influence. Silent enforcement sustains systems longer than overt authority. It allows operations to function efficiently, preserves loyalty, and minimizes friction. Bilotti's skill was in maintaining this balance continuously, quietly, and effectively. Even under pressure, even when threats emerged unexpectedly, he operated with precision. Interventions were calculated, consequences controlled, and outcomes aligned with strategic priorities. The world around him adjusted instinctively, unaware of the subtle orchestration maintaining order. In the end, Thomas Bilotti exemplified the art of silent enforcement. Discipline over display, subtlety over spectacle, and consistency over chaos. His work ensured stability, mitigated risk, and preserved authority, all without fanfare or recognition. Those who observe his method gain insight into the invisible mechanics that sustain systems where exposure is dangerous and precision is essential. Survival in the underworld is rarely glamorous. It is quiet, deliberate, and often invisible to outsiders. For Thomas Bilotti, survival was less about confrontation and more about anticipation, adaptation, and the careful calibration of behavior. Thomas Bilotti understood that the world he inhabited demanded strategies that were subtle, precise, and enduring. Bold moves might impress, but they could also destroy. The real art lay in quiet strategy. The first principle of survival was observation. Bilotti spent more time watching than acting. Every interaction, gesture, and conversation was a signal. He interpreted these cues to understand intentions, assess risk, and identify opportunity. Awareness was never passive, it was a continuous, disciplined practice. By the time action became necessary, he already understood the landscape better than anyone else. Adaptability was the second principle. The environment was fluid, shaped by shifting loyalties, rivalries, law enforcement pressure, and unpredictable events. Bilotti adapted continuously, recalibrating responses to align with new realities. Survival required flexibility, but not at the expense of stability. Every adjustment was measured to maintain continuity while addressing immediate threats. Proximity to power amplified both opportunity and risk. Bilotti was close enough to influence decisions, but not so exposed that mistakes could go unnoticed. This balance allowed him to guide outcomes subtly while minimizing vulnerability. Being near the center of action provided insight, but also demanded constant vigilance. A single lapse could trigger exposure or misalignment with leadership expectations. Trust management was a critical component of survival. Bilotti cultivated relationships carefully, ensuring that loyalty could be counted on without compromising discretion. He relied on competence rather than sentiment. Those around him were valued for reliability and alignment with objectives. Personal bonds were secondary to functional necessity. Information control underpinned nearly every survival strategy. Bilotti understood that knowledge equaled leverage, and mismanagement of information could be fatal. He shared what was necessary, withheld what was dangerous, and interpreted data with precision. Decisions were informed by context and verified signals, not speculation or rumor. Risk assessment was continuous. Bilotti considered the consequences of action, inaction, and misperception simultaneously. Each decision involved multiple layers of evaluation: impact on immediate operations, effect on relationships, potential scrutiny from leadership or law enforcement, and influence on broader stability. Survival demanded foresight. Psychological resilience was equally essential. The pressures of this environment were relentless. Fear, uncertainty, and stress could distort judgment. Bilotti mastered emotional control, ensuring that decisions were based on strategy rather than impulse. Calmness was both a personal shield and a tool for influencing others. Subtlety defined execution. Bilotti's interventions were rarely visible. Adjustments were implemented quietly, maintaining system stability without attracting attention. Others perceived outcomes as natural or self-regulating, unaware that the equilibrium depended on continuous, calculated input. Survival also required prioritization. Not every threat could be addressed simultaneously. Bilotti evaluated which risks posed immediate danger and which could be deferred. This triage preserved focus, ensured efficiency, and prevented overextension. Every action was deliberate, every choice intentional. Adaptation extended to behavioral presentation. Bilotti adjusted how he appeared in different settings, demonstrating authority when necessary, discretion when required, and neutrality when beneficial. His persona was calibrated to maintain influence without attracting unnecessary attention. Visibility was minimized strategically, not arbitrarily. From an educational perspective, Bilotti's approach highlights a critical principle. Survival in high-risk systems is less about confrontation and more about anticipation, observation, and subtle adjustment. Those who succeed are rarely the loudest. They are the most disciplined. They influence outcomes invisibly and navigate threats without creating unnecessary exposure. Isolation was an inevitable byproduct. Those capable of understanding and executing such strategies were few. Sharing the burden of insight risked dilution or exposure. Bilotti operated in a space defined by observation, discretion, and calculated intervention. This independence allowed precision, but also increased responsibility. External pressures tested these strategies continuously. Law enforcement investigations, rival ambitions, operational disruptions, and unexpected events required instant analysis and measured response. Bilotti managed these pressures without panic, relying on the quiet discipline of preparation, calculation, and subtle intervention. Long-term survival required a combination of consistency and innovation. Bilotti maintained routines that reinforced stability while continuously adapting tactics to account for change. Predictable patterns provided reliability while strategic variation prevented exploitation. Balance between stability and flexibility was critical. Influence, trust, and discretion converged into a single, cohesive survival strategy. By observing, adapting, controlling information, and managing perception, Bilotti navigated a landscape defined by unpredictability and risk. Outcomes were shaped subtly, threats mitigated preemptively, and systems maintained without overt intervention. The lesson embedded here is clear. Survival in complex, high-risk environments depends on quiet strategy, not dramatic action. Awareness, anticipation, and disciplined intervention create resilience. Exposure is minimized, stability is preserved, and influence is maintained without overt display. Thomas Bilotti exemplified the mastery of these principles. He operated where visibility was dangerous, influence was subtle, and survival depended on continuous assessment. By balancing observation, discretion, and calculated action, he ensured that both his position and the system he served remained secure. In a world defined by unpredictability, quiet strategy became the ultimate tool. It allowed Bilotti to endure, influence outcomes, and navigate threats without losing ground. His effectiveness was measured not in recognition or spectacle, but in the continuous functioning of the system he helped stabilize. In the underworld, certain decisions carry a permanence that ordinary life rarely demands. For Thomas Bilotti, the gravity of these choices was inescapable. Each decision had consequences, sometimes immediate, often far-reaching, and occasionally irreversible. Thomas Bilotti understood early that power brought not only influence but an enduring burden. The weight of choices that, once made, could not be undone. Decisions of consequence arose from a complex web of operational, relational, and strategic factors. Bilotti did not make choices lightly. Every action required consideration of loyalty, risk, timing, and perception. The margins for error were minimal. A wrong judgment could expose vulnerabilities, destabilize operations, or provoke confrontation from rivals. He approached decisions methodically. Observation was the first step. By gathering information, interpreting subtle signals, and assessing context, he ensured that every potential outcome was considered. This step alone often prevented hasty errors, as insight revealed factors that were not immediately visible. Next came analysis. Bilotti mentally mapped the possible scenarios resulting from each action. He weighed immediate consequences against long-term implications, factoring in reactions from allies, adversaries, and leadership. Each variable interacted with the others, creating a complex matrix of potential outcomes. Decision-making became a process of predictive calculation. Timing was critical. Acting too soon risked exposing intent, while waiting too long could allow circumstances to spiral beyond control. Bilotti developed an intuitive sense of timing, knowing when to intervene, when to observe, and when to withhold action entirely. Precision in execution minimized the likelihood of negative fallout. Responsibility compounded the weight of decision. Those around him relied on his judgment, trusting that his choices would preserve stability and prevent unnecessary conflict. This trust magnified both the risk and the consequence of each action. Bilotti could not abdicate responsibility. The system depended on his insight. The permanence of decisions extended beyond operational outcomes. Relationships, trust, and reputation were all impacted. A single choice could reinforce loyalty or trigger distrust. Alignments could shift, altering the balance of power in ways that could not be reversed. Bilotti accounted for these social dynamics, understanding that influence and authority were as fragile as they were essential. Psychologically, the weight was relentless. Bilotti carried the awareness that any miscalculation could have irreversible consequences. Stress, fatigue, and pressure were constant companions. Emotional control became essential. Hesitation or rashness could both lead to exposure or error. Discipline was not optional, it was survival. The consequences of high-stakes decisions were often invisible. The outside world rarely saw the careful calculations that prevented conflict, mitigated risk, or preserved operational stability. Bilotti's effectiveness was measured not by recognition, but by the absence of disruption. Success was quiet, failure catastrophic. Strategic foresight played a critical role. Bilotti anticipated how decisions would ripple through multiple layers of the organization. He evaluated not only immediate outcomes, but also the potential for secondary effects, shifts in alliances, changes in perception, or unintended attention from rivals. Each decision was a node in a chain, and he ensured that each link was secure. Trust management intertwined with decision-making. Bilotti ensured that those tasked with executing choices understood expectations without compromising discretion. Delegation was strategic. Too much reliance increased exposure. Too little risked inefficiency. He calibrated responsibility, ensuring that execution aligned with intended outcomes. Moral complexity compounded the burden. Some decisions required actions that challenged conventional ethics. Bilotti approached these pragmatically, separating personal judgment from functional necessity. The system demanded outcomes. Morality was secondary. Compartmentalization allowed him to act decisively without internal conflict disrupting judgment. External threats intensified decision pressure. Law enforcement investigations, rival ambitions, and operational uncertainties meant that even well-considered choices could have unintended consequences. Bilotti mitigated these risks through careful planning, redundancy, and contingency preparation. The survival depended not on chance, but on strategy. Isolation reinforced the weight of decisions. Few possessed the insight, discipline, and perspective required to navigate high-stakes choice effectively. Bilotti operated largely independently, analyzing scenarios and predicting outcomes without the benefit of external counsel. Independence allowed precision but increased responsibility. Education for observers of his life demonstrates a key principle. In environments defined by risk, the weight of irreversible decisions is immense. Success requires observation, analysis, timing, and discipline. Influence depends on the ability to execute these choices without drawing unnecessary attention. Recognition is rare. Consequence is immediate. Bilotti's mastery. These principles allowed him to navigate complexity with composure. He balanced short-term urgency with long-term stability, mitigating risk while guiding outcomes. Each decision reinforced the perception of reliability, enhancing his influence and preserving operational continuity. Yet the burden was constant. Every choice reminded him that action and inaction alike carried consequence. The weight of permanence shaped behavior, limited freedom, and demanded continuous engagement. There was no respite, only calculated execution. The lesson is clear: the higher the stakes, the greater the responsibility. Decisions that cannot be undone define both the individual and the system they serve. Those who endure understand that power is inseparable from consequence, and mastery lies in balancing risk, timing, and foresight. Thomas Bilotti's ability to make high-stakes decisions without error, hesitation, or exposure demonstrates the skill, discipline, and foresight required to survive at the highest levels. His life illustrates the silent burden carried by those whose choices shape outcomes, influence systems, and preserve stability even when the world remains unaware. In a domain where consequences are immediate and irreversible, the quiet execution of judgment becomes both an art and a necessity. Bilotti exemplified this balance, ensuring that each choice, however heavy, maintained order, preserved influence, and minimized risk. His survival was a testament to the mastery of decisions that cannot be undone. Control is rarely absolute, especially in a world defined by unpredictability, ambition, and risk. For Thomas Bilotti, true control was not about dominance or intimidation. It was about creating an invisible web that guided outcomes, influenced behavior, and preserved stability without overt assertion. Thomas Bilotti understood that the most effective power operates quietly, subtly, and persistently. The first strand of this invisible web was observation. Bilotti monitored the environment constantly, assessing relationships, alliances, and emerging threats. Every conversation, gesture, and interaction provided data. From these details, he constructed a mental map of the operational and social landscape, understanding not only what was happening but why. This comprehensive awareness allowed him to anticipate potential disruptions before they materialized. The second strand was influence. Unlike overt authority, which relies on visible hierarchy, Bilotti's control worked through perception. He cultivated an expectation that behavior aligned naturally with organizational objectives. People adjusted instinctively not because they were commanded, but because they understood the consequences of deviation. Influence, in this sense, was preemptive, shaping behavior before conflict arose. Timing amplified effectiveness. Bilotti knew when to intervene and when to observe. Acting too soon could disrupt stability. Waiting too long could allow small issues to grow. His ability to calibrate action with precision reinforced his influence. Decisions were implemented at moments that maximized compliance while minimizing exposure. Another critical component was trust. Bilotti's influence depended on credibility, reliability, and discretion. Those around him followed not from fear, but from confidence that his judgment preserved order. He cultivated trust carefully, relying on competence rather than personal affection. Trust was functional, measured by consistent alignment with organizational priorities. Control extended to the flow of information. Bilotti strategically managed what others knew, when they knew it, and how they interpreted it. Properly calibrated communication minimized misunderstandings, prevented rumor, and guided decision-making. Information itself became a tool of influence, shaping perception while preserving discretion. Yet control was never absolute. The web was flexible, allowing adjustments as circumstances shifted. Rival ambitions, external pressures, and unforeseen events required constant adaptation. Bilotti monitored variables continuously, ensuring the web remained taut but not rigid. Stability required both strength and elasticity. Isolation was a necessary aspect. Few could operate at this level of strategic observation and influence. Bilotti relied on his own judgment, executing subtle interventions without external guidance. Independence increased precision but also intensified responsibility. Every thread of the web depended on his vigilance. Psychological discipline was paramount. The demands of continuous observation, assessment, and intervention were exhausting. Emotional reactions could weaken the web, creating vulnerabilities. Bilotti maintained composure at all times, ensuring that his presence reinforced stability without revealing the depth of his control. The mechanics of the web extended to enforcement. Deviations from expected behavior were corrected quietly without confrontation. Minor disruptions were absorbed and redirected, preventing escalation. The appearance of equilibrium was maintained, even when interventions were ongoing and invisible. Relationships functioned as nodes within this network. Bilotti ensured that alliances, loyalties, and obligations reinforced desired outcomes. Interaction was functional rather than personal, structured to maintain alignment and prevent instability. Strategic withdrawal was used when emotional involvement threatened objectivity. External threats, rivals, law enforcement, operational failures were anticipated and mitigated. Bilotti's proactive interventions ensured that minor risks did not escalate into crisis. The system operated as though self-regulating, but in reality, it relied heavily on his constant vigilance and strategic calibration. From an educational standpoint, this chapter illustrates the nature of invisible control. True influence does not require spectacle. It operates beneath awareness, guiding behavior, preserving stability, and mitigating risk. The most effective leaders often shape outcomes quietly, relying on observation, timing, trust, and subtle intervention. Yet the burden of maintaining this web was immense. Continuous mental engagement, anticipation of every possible contingency, and the discipline to act subtly demanded resilience. Fatigue was unavoidable, but failure was not an option. Every moment required awareness and precision. Control, influence, and survival converged. Bilotti's ability to maintain the invisible web ensured that the organization functioned efficiently, disputes were minimized, and operational goals were met. His effectiveness was measured by stability, continuity, and compliance, rather than recognition or acknowledgement. The lesson here is enduring. Power is most effective when it is invisible. Influence, observation, and subtle intervention shape outcomes more reliably than overt authority. Stability depends not on dominance, but on the quiet orchestration of events, relationships, and information. Thomas Bilotti exemplified mastery of this principle. He operated where visibility was dangerous, influence was subtle, and consequences were immediate. By weaving an invisible web of control, he preserved order, mitigated risk, and guided outcomes continuously. His presence was felt even when it was not seen. Even under intense pressure, Bilotti's strategies remained intact. The invisible web adapted, absorbed shocks, and maintained alignment. Stability was sustained not by spectacle, but by disciplined execution, strategic foresight, and continuous calibration. In the end, the essence of influence and survival is quiet, precise, and pervasive. Bilotti, his ability to weave this invisible web ensured that both he and the system endured. The environment may have been unpredictable, but his mastery of subtle control allowed him to navigate it with consistency, discretion, and effectiveness. Legacy is rarely about fame. It is not measured by recognition or applause. For Thomas Bilotti, legacy was defined by discipline, loyalty, and the enduring impact of decisions executed with precision. Thomas Bilotti understood that the value of his life was in the systems he stabilized, the influence he exerted quietly, and the order he preserved. His legacy would be invisible to many, yet its effects would persist long after his presence faded. Discipline had been the cornerstone of Bilotti's life. From the earliest days, he cultivated control over thought, emotion, and behavior. Every action was measured, every word considered, every move deliberate. Discipline was not a rigid code, but a guiding principle, enabling him to navigate the constant pressures, risks, and unpredictabilities of the environment he inhabited. Without it, survival would have been impossible. Loyalty defined his relationships. Not a casual sentiment, but a principle anchored in consistency and trust. Bilotti's loyalty was unwavering to those he served, and in return it commanded respect, reliance, and alignment. Loyalty was functional and reciprocal. It built trust, ensured operational stability, and strengthened influence. It was the thread connecting individuals to the larger system, sustaining cohesion in a world defined by uncertainty. Legacy also arose from the impact of his decisions. In a life where every choice carried consequence, the mark of wisdom was not only survival but the preservation of order, continuity, and trust. Decisions executed carefully ensured that systems endured, that crises were mitigated, and that alliances remained intact. Each calculated action extended influence beyond immediate perception, creating outcomes that persisted quietly but effectively. Bilotti understood that visibility was a liability. Recognition could invite scrutiny, challenge, or exposure. True influence was measured not by notice but by effectiveness. The systems he maintained functioned seamlessly, yet few outside the inner circle understood the full scope of his contributions. Legacy, then, was invisible but durable. Control, exercised subtly, reinforced this legacy. Bilotti's approach was never to dominate, but to guide outcomes through observation, timing, and strategic intervention. Influence was woven quietly into the fabric of operations. Systems maintained themselves, alliances aligned, and disputes were managed before they became crises, all through the disciplined orchestration of his presence. Survival was inseparable from legacy. The ability to endure in a world defined by risk and volatility ensured that influence persisted. Bilotti's mastery of anticipation, adaptability, and discretion allowed him to preserve not only his life but the functionality of the organization. Endurance was itself a form of impact. Survival enabled continuity, which enabled legacy. Mentorship and example also contributed to his enduring influence. Even without formal teaching, the consistency of his discipline, loyalty, and judgment served as a model. Peers observed, emulated, and deferred. The culture of quiet competence, calm under pressure, and strategic foresight propagated through his presence. In this way, his approach became institutionalized, shaping behavior beyond his direct actions. The personal cost of such a legacy was considerable. Isolation, relentless responsibility, and the burden of irreversible decisions were constant companions. Personal life, emotional expression, and simple freedoms were often secondary to the demands of influence and survival. Yet Bilotti accepted these costs as intrinsic to the preservation of order and the cultivation of trust. From an educational perspective, his life illustrates the principle that lasting influence arises from mastery of subtlety, discipline, and relational alignment. Visibility is optional, effectiveness is essential. Systems endure not because of spectacle, but because of quiet consistency, strategic foresight, and careful stewardship. Legacy is measured in sustained function, not applause. The culmination of Bilotti's life was reflected in the cumulative effect of these principles. Systems were stabilized, threats mitigated, and alliances preserved. Those around him operated with confidence, influenced by his judgment, even when unaware of its full scope. The world continued to function seamlessly, a testament to the quiet mastery he exerted over complexity and risk. Even in the face of volatility, Bilotti remained composed. His ability to anticipate outcomes, guide behavior, and enforce order discreetly ensured that the environment adapted, stabilized, and endured. The outcomes of his life were embedded in the resilience of the organization, the alignment of relationships, and the continuity of operations. The ultimate lesson from Bilotti's legacy is profound. Influence, survival, and lasting impact do not require visibility or recognition. They require discipline, loyalty, foresight, and strategic action. The most enduring power is exercised quietly, consistently, and without fanfare. Those who master these principles leave a mark not in headlines, but in stability, order, and sustained influence. In reflection, Thomas Bilotti's life demonstrates that legacy is not about who remembers, but about what continues. Systems remain intact because of decisions made with precision. People continue to operate effectively because of trust established and maintained. The influence of a disciplined, loyal, and perceptive individual can ripple quietly through time, sustaining structures, guiding behavior, and ensuring continuity long after direct presence ends. His legacy was a testament to the principle that mastery over self, relationships, and environment creates enduring influence. Discipline allowed precise action, loyalty built trust. Foresight ensured stability, subtlety preserved discretion. Together, these elements wove a legacy that persisted beyond visibility, recognition, or acclaim. For those observing, the insight is invaluable. The most profound influence is often invisible. Survival, stability, and legacy depend on continuous attention, subtle intervention, and disciplined judgment. Power may attract notice, but enduring impact is the product of quiet, consistent mastery over complexity and risk. Thomas Bilotti's life and work exemplified the culmination of these truths. The systems he guided, the order he preserved, and the influence he exerted quietly remain his enduring mark. In a world defined by volatility, his legacy demonstrates that discipline, loyalty, and subtle mastery create outcomes far more enduring than recognition or fame ever could. In the end, Bilotti's story is one of quiet resilience, invisible influence, and a legacy built not on spectacle but on mastery, precision, and unwavering commitment to the principles that preserved order, mitigated risk, and ensured survival in the most challenging environment imaginable.